It is really wonderful to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion about hybrid work and hearing some of your stories. So today, my focus is going to be on what we know about hybrid work and what we can predict and prepare for based on other research that is relevant to hybrid work and the kinds of things that happen when we are working in a hybrid way. And we need to rely on that research at this point because, of course, hybrid work is so new. I'm going to move pretty quickly through my slides. I'll pull them up in a second. But we should have a nice chunk of time at the end to have questions and more of a conversation about this. So with that, I'm going to pull up my slides. All right, here we go. So let's move forward. All right, so this is one of the ways that I think about the existing research that is relevant to remote and hybrid work. There's actually been really decades of research that looks at distributed and remote work. And on this graph, you can see I've got two different dimensions that I find helpful in thinking about this. One is whether or not everybody is co-located or not. So on one end, you can have everybody is sitting in the same office, kind of traditional co-located work. On the other end, nobody is sitting there together. We've got people spread around different locations, working from home, working from co-working sites, and so forth. And then, of course, there's a range in the middle. On the other dimension, we have whether or not this is a temporary state. It's sort of fluid. People are sometimes doing one thing, sometimes doing another thing. Or is this a persistent state, something that we can count on day after day? We're going to go to wherever we work and see the same people in that location, or consistently be working from our home environment. So, in the everyone co-located and persistent state, that's sort of traditional co-located teams. There's tons and tons of research on that, although most teams really are not working that way anymore. Most of my research over the last couple of decades is focused on distributed and global work. So where we've got a case where we have multiple locations, but there are usually subgroups of people at each of those locations. So let's say we've got, part of the team is located here in Palo Alto, part of the team is located in Paris, part of the team is located in Bangalore, India. So they are geographically distributed, but there's some people who are co-located there. And those tend to be pretty stable, so quite persistent. There's also some very new research looking at fully virtual organizations. So these are organizations that for the most part never actually had a headquarters. They never had a there. So everybody has worked from home or co-working sites. And there's quite a bit we can actually learn from how they have done this very successfully. And a number have, for example, GitLabs, Ultranauts, and so forth. There's a bit of a research base in telecommuting. There's a little bit older research, and the focus tends to be on how managers can monitor people who are not coming in every day, or on how employees can advance their careers and some of the limitations in their ability to advance their careers if they are not coming into the office on a regular basis. So that's somewhat useful, but maybe a little bit limited for us. Now, where we're at now is, I think, right in the center, hybrid work, where some are going to be co-located, some aren't going to be there. It's going to be some of the time, not all the time. It's probably going to be quite fluid. And my prediction is that this is not going to stabilize for at least another few years as we figure it out, because it's such a new way of working. And probably we're going to see a lot of different models for hybrid work, depending upon the geography, the industry, the type of work being done, and so forth. So what I'm seeing right now is the beginning of a lot of experimentation to try to figure out what makes sense for different organizations, different work functions, and so forth with regard to hybrid. So what I'm going to do with the first part of this talk is talk a little bit about what we can actually learn from this previous research that's been done that relates then to hybrid work. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I see above and beyond that for working in a hybrid fashion. And just to answer the question at the outset, is hybrid work here to stay? Yeah, it is. I would bet a lot that we are going to see hybrid work in some form, and it will be with us for a long time. What form that takes, I think, is still an open question. All right, so one of the things that we can learn from research on distributed and remote work is around the technology. So we are reliant on technology when we are working in a remote or distributed or hybrid way. In order to communicate, we're using email, we're using video, we're using phone, we're using chat, and so forth. And by definition, reliance on these technologies provides fewer social cues than we would normally have if we are face-to-face. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. The other thing that happens when we are not physically together is we're not sharing the same context. We don't, it may be morning here and evening there. The weather might be different. The culture might be different. The political or economic situation might be very different. And all of that matters to what we see as the behavioral options available to us. So that becomes important when we are trying to collaborate across distance. And the other thing that happens is we tend to be exposed to different information if we are in different locations. Different information becomes salient by virtue of, who we're talking to, where it is we're looking. And if we are, co-located with a small group of people, we might be talking about our perspectives and develop more of a shared perspective among the people who are co-located that's then not shared with people who are geographically distant. And all of these things, and again, decades of research have been done on all of these characteristics that show that they create challenges in, one, staying connected, and that is staying connected to the organization and feeling like people are a part of and identified with the organization, but also staying connected to one's colleagues and feeling like there's rapport, trust, and so forth that's so important to having satisfying and effective work relationships. And then the other effect that it has is challenges to staying on the same page, staying coordinated in the work that we're doing, avoiding miscommunications. One of the things that we see in distributed teams is that a team will get together, they will decide upon their path forward, be very explicit and clear about that. But particularly in environments where the work is a little bit ambiguous, we're making these small decisions, hour after hour each day, and that can lead to a divergence in the way that we're approaching a task that we're not even necessarily aware of ourselves. And then 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, we get back together and oops, we've actually taken quite different paths and it's very hard to integrate that work. So we see that a lot as a result of being physically distant, reliant on technology, and not having a shared context. So a little bit more about the limitations of technology itself. There is a theory called media richness theory that suggests that, on one hand, you have face-to-face interaction, which is very rich. That's what we're accustomed to. There's a lot of information that flows. You also get voice intonation, which is really important in disambiguating a communication. You get gestures, and not only just, from the neck up, but also, toe tapping, fidgeting, and so forth. You get really clear facial expressions, which helps to understand, if somebody is confused, if somebody's frustrated, and so forth. And we are, by definition, in the same physical context when we're face to face. As you move to the left, down this, toward lean, we get less and less of that information, fewer and fewer social cues. So, once we're in email, it's asynchronous, we're getting very little of that information. In video conference, it's better. We are getting the information. Intonation is pretty good in most video. We don't get as much on gestures, and probably most importantly, we don't get the granularity in the facial expressions, particularly if you've got, like those little tiny postage stamp size pictures of people. It's hard to read these really nuanced and subtle cues that people send that we often process subconsciously when we are together face to face, but we just know more about how people are reacting to us. And then, of course, we don't have a shared context. The other thing that we lose when we are reliant on technology is spontaneous interaction. There are a lot of systems that are trying to do this, but it's just really hard to replace the conversations that you have when you're riding the elevator up to the office together, or you run into somebody in the kitchen grabbing a cup of tea, or also going into and out of meetings. There's a lot of chit chat that happens as people get set up for a meeting, debriefing that happens as people leave meetings. And all of that is really important to people being able to develop rapport and stay on the same page. And then the last one I won't say much about, but I have heard that some people actually do email during meetings. I'm sure none of us do, but it can be really hard, particularly with Zoom fatigue, to make sure that people are really fully present to the interactions we're having. This is just, I thought, a very cute cartoon, the head tilts that we can see as we are in a meeting and people are confused. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about trust. And what I'd like you to do is just think about this question for a second and answer to yourself, is there more trust or less trust or about the same amount of trust if you are working in a remote or distributed team? So that is the question that I set out to answer with a PhD student, Roxana Zolin, and then some other faculty here at Stanford. And we were really surprised to find that there was no difference. At month 1, there's pretty much the same level of trust. And at time 3, month 3, there was about the same. It didn't change over time, and it wasn't different between the co-located and the distributed team members. And that really surprised us, because anecdotally, we had heard that trust was really hard to establish when people are not geographically distributed. And these, by the way, were architecture, engineering, and construction teams. So we dove a little bit more deeply into the data. And what we found was that there were the trust on co-located teams was much more volatile. So we ended up with many more increases in trust, but also many more decreases in trust. So people, as they work together, share the same context, see one another day after day, they get more information about whether or not the person is trustworthy, and then they update their view of trust accordingly. On the distributed teams, there was less of this. There were both fewer increases in trust and fewer decreases in trust. So what we found was that these first impressions, these very early impressions in a team really matter, and they sort of form a baseline, and then people interpret later behaviors through that lens that's been established early on. And some later research shows that, in particular, when we're distributed, we pay attention to reliability and predictability as indicators of trust. Those are much more discernible when we are geographically distributed than some of the more subtle indicators of trust, like kindness, benevolence, and so forth. I also want to say a little bit about subgroup dynamics, and I think this is this has been just a pervasive issue in geographically distributed teams. I've seen it in study after study, and I'll come back to it when we're talking about hybrid teams. So subgroup dynamics happen when you've got somebody, a group of people in one location and a group of people in another location. So again, let's say we've got Palo Alto and we've got Bangalore. We are collaborating together, say on a software development project. There is the tendency, the very strong tendency for people in the locations they obviously spend more time with each other. They get to know one another better. They share similar information. They often share similar cultural backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So the bonds between people at each location are stronger than the bonds across location. And when things go wrong, there is a tendency for blame to happen across these subgroups at these locations. And information asymmetries tend to persist where there is information shared within one location that either doesn't get shared or doesn't have the same salience or the same interpretation in other locations. This research shows that one of the most powerful ways to overcome these subgroup dynamics when people are remote is to make sure that the team across locations has a common vision. They understand that they are in it together and they have a shared sense of identity. And that's something that leaders can do. Leaders need to establish, they need to reinforce. And one of the challenges is that it's harder to establish. Leaders have to work harder to establish and maintain the shared identity across locations. But that's the most powerful way to overcome subgroup dynamics. We talked about this a little bit already, the absence of common ground or unshared context when people are not inhabiting the same physical, temporal, and cultural context. And again, those things around us in our world have an effect on how we're feeling, how we're working, and what the behavioral options are for us in a given moment. One of the really interesting pieces about this is that as human beings, we're terrible at communicating contextual information. And part of that is because we don't necessarily know what is different to communicate about. So we don't necessarily know, unless, for example, it's in the news, we don't know that there's a heat wave in another location, or we don't know that there are fires, or we don't know that there's some other kind of disruption. So we don't think to talk about it, and as a result, that doesn't get shared. So this is some kind of stylized data from a study that I did with Mark Mortensen, who's now at INSEAD, and we were looking at the level of geographic distribution on these R&D teams and the extent to which they had task conflict. And what we found was that when they had a high shared context, meaning that they had a very similar context that they were working in, and or they were very familiar with the differences in context, it didn't matter whether they were geographically distributed. There was no change in the amount of conflict on these teams. But when they didn't have a shared context and they were distributed, we saw very high levels of task conflict. So having a shared context is important in these teams. So what can we do as leaders about some of these things that we already know about being remote and distributed? Well, one is turn on your video. And, there are some people who don't want their videos on, and I think we need to respect that. But as long as people are willing, it really helps to get that additional social information when people are visible on the video. You get the additional, facial expressions, gestures, and so forth. It's also helpful to make time for social conversations, make sure that there are virtual events, check-ins at the beginning of meetings, and so forth. And I know many, many people have been doing this through the pandemic, and it's been helpful. And one of the reasons that this is important is because those check-ins, those informal conversations at the beginning of meetings, um, and informal, more social events is where a lot of that contextual information ends up getting shared. We tend not to share it in more formal settings, but it's more likely to slip out when we are in more social settings. In bold, I have here reinforce shared vision and priorities. Again, that is just hugely important for any team. It becomes more important and harder for remote teams, and I would wager for hybrid teams. It's really helpful for leaders to model remote work. Some of the data shows that leaders pretty much want to go back into the office, and workers to a large extent want to be hybrid or work from home. But if the leaders are going back into the office and are kind of going back to the normal way of operating, that makes it really hard for the people who are working remote or working hybrid. So it's really important for leaders, even if they are going back to the office, to act like remote workers sometimes, and make sure that they are very visible and active in those meetings and such, as a remote worker. It's also very helpful to host regular face-to-face gatherings. This is something that Jen Reimer, who studied these fully remote organizations, found was that almost all of them that were really successful had regular face-to-face gatherings, sometimes with the whole company, multiple times per year, in order to, revisit those connections, reestablish the connection to the organization, and have knowledge sharing take place in a more informal way. It's also really helpful to share feedback on work in progress. And this is something that agile methods do well, is just, kind of quick check-ins pretty much every day, make sure that we're not diverging. We can then, we're prompted to share, the little decisions that we've made each day and what we're working on. And that kind of helps to avoid that divergence. And then again, Jen Reimer's research shows that providing a rich public decision process and trail is super helpful. So Ultranauts, which is a fully virtual organization, records, transcribes, and archives all meetings and process information so that people can get access to this, and they publish it on a company-wide Slack channel. And that's something that I think we need to move more toward as organizations as we work in a hybrid way. Finally, it's really helpful for leaders to think about the medium that they're using. And there's a theory called media choice theory. But the gist, I think the most important pieces, or the gist of it, are that you need to be a bit thoughtful about which medium you're choosing for which kinds of communications with certain kinds of people. In a nutshell, the stronger the relationship that you have with people, the more familiar you are with them, the less rich the medium needs to be, because we can kind of fill in those gaps. We know people. There's not going to be as much risk of offending or miscommunicating. However, if the content is particularly complex or ambiguous or emotional, then you're better off going with some sort of rich medium so that you can read those cues. You can get a sense of how it's hitting people. Those cues are just really important for understanding whether or not a communication is going off the rails, either in terms of content or people's emotional reactions. And then finally, my general rule is if somebody asks for a particular type of medium, and in particular, if this person is lower in power, then I would defer to that. So for example, an employee might say, I really would like a face-to-face meeting. What they're signaling is that that might be emotional, that they might it might be complex, they might have difficulty communicating it in some other way, then, if at all possible, go forward with a face-to-face or a video interaction. Similarly, if somebody, again, with less power says, I'm just not comfortable having a video meeting, I really want, a less rich mode here, what they're signaling is that, somehow they don't want their emotions to be read. They want the protection of the video. So again, just something that it has become more important to pay attention to. Okay, so just a recap on this portion. So what I've been talking about is what we know from decades of research on remote and distributed work, on fully virtual organizations, and so forth. And what we know is that distance, technology use, and unshared context make it hard to connect socially and to keep continuity in the work and avoid misunderstandings. But leaders can step in and help mitigate some of these effects by establishing or reestablishing rituals that help build social ties between people, make these connections, reinforcing a shared vision and shared identity, modeling remote and hybrid work themselves, so kind of the eating your own dog food piece of it, and ensuring that persistent and up-to-date information is available for those who, have a bad internet connection or, where the time difference doesn't work for them, and so forth. And the previous research provides some really great guidance, I think, along these lines, but there's some additional challenges that I want to talk a bit about. So first of all, again, back to the question of, is remote work, is hybrid work here to stay? The answer is yes. There are a lot of pressures that are pushing us that direction, and I think it's going to be hard to reverse course. Why is that? One, people are just really tired of the commute, and they've gotten a taste of saving those hours a day by not commuting, and they want to continue that. In urban areas in particular, the cost of living is really high, and people have found that they can move further out and live better as a result. There's also pretty good evidence that it works, at least with highly educated professional workers. Employees report being more productive and happier when they were working from home. We'll see what happens with hybrid. They worked fewer hours. They reported fewer distractions. They said they were happier in their work, and they were more authentic. They were able to bring their entire self to the job, which is a really good thing. There's also less work from home stigma. When we talk to people who used to work from home pre-pandemic, they felt really isolated. There was a stigma to it. They didn't, nobody worked to include them. And that's sort of gone away. There's more of an acceptance that this is a normal way of working, which makes it more appealing for people to do. And then in a more global sense, it supports sustainability goals, reducing, for example, the amount of commuting. And for organizations, it's possible to reduce real estate costs. Although I have one caution there. I think that if the focus is too much on the real estate costs, I see suboptimal decisions being made that then affect how people are connecting and the coordination of work. So there's a real balance to be found there. And workers just generally are demanding this level of flexibility. I'm not sure how many of you heard about this, but 1/3 of workers at Stitch Fix, which is a Bay Area company, in August announced that they were going to leave, or going to quit their jobs because they were told that they weren't going to have the kind of flexibility that they had enjoyed during the pandemic. So, we're seeing a lot of people considering other work as a result of the different policies around flexibility. All right, so this chart is based on a Gallup poll in 2021, and what it shows is that about 50% of the respondents, this was 31,000 workers, about 50% want to work in some kind of hybrid way. A few want to be exclusively remote. A fair number want to be in the office, but a lot want this mix of hybrid. Interestingly enough, this is a survey that was done by the Future Forum. And what they found was that not only do workers want flexibility in where they work, but they also, even more so, have come to appreciate and want flexibility in when they're working, what their hours of work are. So that's an additional challenge that we're going to be working with. Okay, some specific concerns about hybrid work. I talked earlier about subgroup dynamics in hybrid teams. I anticipate that we're going to see something similar. I'm sorry, I talked previously about subgroup dynamics in distributed teams. I think we're going to see something similar when we're talking about hybrid teams. So the scenario being that if we've got a bunch of people in the office who are going in on a regular basis and a bunch of people who are remote and going in very rarely, I anticipate that we're going to see a subgroup dynamic where you've got the in the office people interacting a lot, building bonds, getting to know one another, sharing information. And this will create a strong subgroup among them that excludes people who are remote. And maybe some of the remote people will form their own subgroup, but chances are it will be weaker. And that can lead to people who are remote feeling like they're second-class citizens, they're excluded, they're overwhelmed by the power of the people in the office. So this is something I think we need to think a lot about in terms of structuring remote work in a way that minimizes this potential for subgroup dynamics. One of the things that we're doing in management science and engineering is we're having a couple of common days. So everybody's coming in 2 days a week. And then the other day is floating so that we at least have some overlap between everybody. And of course, it's going to depend a lot on the work, a lot on the job, a lot on the employees. But I do think it's something we need to think about. I'm going to skip that one and go to cross-team interaction. So this is something else that I think is hugely important. What I'm seeing as I talk to organizations is a very strong focus on supporting the work, supporting the team, the project, and so forth. And that's extremely important. But I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that cross-team interactions, these interactions that happen between different teams in different parts of the organization, are also hugely important for the success of the organization and for the satisfaction of employees. It's one of the ways that employees learn. It's one of the ways that information gets shared so that there's coordination across different parts of the organization. So I think we need to spend more time thinking about how we enable that. There's evidence from a Microsoft study that was conducted during sheltering in place that showed that collaboration time across groups dropped by about 25% from pre-pandemic levels, meaning that groups became more siloed and there were fewer bridges between them, which they claim then made it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the organization. There are also issues about maintaining a healthy and unified culture. How do we make sure that everybody is exposed to the same indicators or markers of culture in the same way? Traditionally, the indicators of culture that we pay attention to and that unifies a culture in an organization are in the physical environment. It's, the kinds of offices that we have, who sits where, the posters on the wall, the decorations. There are just so many things in our physical world that tell us what the culture is and reinforce that. And we need to get a lot more creative about diffusing those markers of culture through virtual means so that everybody is exposed to those indicators of culture and not just the people who are coming into the office. I'm not going to say a lot about this. We've seen a lot in the news about the challenges of onboarding and training new employees. That will, I think, continue to be an issue in hybrid because there will just be fewer people there in the office to help with the onboarding. So we'll have to be very intentional about that as well. Okay, and I'm going to wrap up here pretty quick, so I will move through this quickly. I'm actually going to skip those. One of the things that I think we do need to be concerned about as we are moving toward hybrid is making sure that we aren't creating more inequities. There's work from Nick Bloom, who's here at Stanford, who showed early on in the pandemic that people with more education and higher income were much more likely to be able to work from home. And there's every reason that would continue. And I'll just say a little bit more here. There is evidence that it's a little bit harder for women when actually I'll go back. When it is a little bit harder for women when they are expected to be constantly connected to work, so that when they're working longer hours and that time is bleeding into family time, women tend to experience lower levels of job satisfaction when that happens. And both men and women experience higher levels of work-family conflict. Okay, so quick wrap up here. Answer is yes, hybrid work is here to stay, and it will take many forms, and we don't really know what all those forms are yet because it's just being discovered. And as a result, we don't know very much about best practices because, again, we're just kind of figuring it out. But what we can expect is the challenges that I described for remote work, plus concerns about more us versus them dynamics between those in the office and those outside of the office. Fewer cross-team synergies, less unified culture, less well-socialized new employees, and the potential for greater inequities. So I think what we need is new ways of leading, less hands-on. We simply can't monitor what people are doing anymore. More intentional virtual communication in order to establish strong cultures, in order to ensure that people are on the same page, and so forth, and also to establish shared identity. And we need leaders that are more tech savvy, who can be really facile in these technologies and communicating with these remote workers. We also desperately need new technologies, especially for supporting informal interactions. Most of the new technologies that we've seen lately support meetings, but a lot of the work, a lot of the connection, a lot of the information sharing happens in the informal interactions. So figuring out how to support informal interactions between people who are in the office and not in the office, I think is really ripe at this point. And, we need enthusiastic and ongoing experimentation within our own organizations and sharing of information across organizations in order to figure out what makes sense here. So thank you very much. I am looking forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion.
Okay. Pam, thank you very much for that presentation. There are so many questions, so we will do our best. And to those who ask questions, thank you for them. I will abbreviate them as much as possible so we can get through as many as we can. One big question focused around your study on trust and the research on trust. And the question is, there's a number of questions embedded, but were these teams that had worked together before, or were they new teams? In other words, were they co-located and then scattered to the winds, or did they start scattered to the winds? Was it done beyond 3 months? And what type of tasks were these teams undertaking, and does that make a difference?
Okay. Yeah. These were new teams. So these were construction, architecture, and engineering teams that got formed in order to create a building, so it was a project. And there may have been some people who had worked together before, but not necessarily. And it was also cross-organizational, I should say. So they were coming together from different organizations. We did not collect any data past 3 months, but the teams did continue to work together for an extended period of time. Does the work matter? I don't know that the work itself matters, but there are characteristics of the work that are important. One of those is the extent to which they are interdependent. If you can go off and do your work on your own, then it doesn't matter as much. But if you are really truly interdependent and need to actively coordinate the work that you're doing, then the trust is very important, and people pay a lot of attention to one another's trustworthiness as they're getting to know them.
More broadly, trust is one factor. There's many factors that go into whether hybrid or remote work can be successful. Are there other things that you see across different industries? And then also there's a question about how does it apply to companies and organizations that produce things? For example, factories and agriculture and fulfillment and deliveries. Does any of this research apply to those kinds of organizations?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that one would want to pay attention to in terms of the effectiveness of a team. So trust, rapport, knowledge sharing, commitment to the team. There's an indicator called psychological safety, which is proven to be extremely important in teams. And that's an indicator of the extent to which people feel open and safe on the team. They can take risks, they can make mistakes, and it's okay. And that leads to a higher level of authenticity and innovation. So there are a lot of different things that one would want to look at to determine whether or not, things are going well on your hybrid team. In terms of industries where, we're making things, how hybrid is structured is obviously going to have to be different. Because if you have to be in the factory working on the car, then people are going to need to be physically there. But the dynamics that I've described, there's no reason to expect that they would be different if people are product designers versus software developers, for example. I'm not sure if that answers that question.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about, about equity in the workforce and how hybrid work relates to this, but there's a question also about inclusivity and reports that remote work removes or reduces microaggressions. Have you seen research about that? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there is not much research on that yet, but there is a study that is really interesting that was done by the Future Forum during the pandemic. It was with 6,000 employees. And what they found was when you looked at the data in the US anyway, and the question that was asked was around whether or not people felt, more connected, belongingness, inclusion kind of thing, pre-pandemic or now. And what was really interesting about that data is that Black employees reported a greater sense of connection, and white employees reported a reduced sense of connection when they were working from home. And a year later in the pandemic, the effect was even stronger, which leads to questions about, well, what is it that's going on? Why is it that Black employees actually feel better about working from home? And it could be that it is that they're not experiencing the microaggressions. It could be that the reduction in social cues is actually helpful in that regard because you can't read the microaggressions quite as easily. But it also could be that they are in an environment, they're in their home environment where they feel more accepted. They can behave in a more authentic way. They don't have to do the kind of code switching that is required of many marginalized employees in the work environment when they are a minority in that work environment. And there are several other possible explanations. We are actually in the process of launching a new study looking exactly at that and trying to understand what the experience is of Black workers as compared to white workers in remote and in hybrid work, because we're trying to disentangle exactly that question. And we're looking for field sites if anyone's interested.
Is there something about the office space that enables or hinders better collaboration relative to some other co-location and some other kind of common location?
That's kind of a hard one to answer because it really depends on what that other location is. So if, for example, they're co-located in a co-working space, that is not dedicated to that organization, you'd have a lot of the same benefits as you would working face-to-face in an office location, assuming that all of the technology, supplies, everything is similar. What you wouldn't have in that situation, though, is those indicators of culture, those things that make a particular organization unique when you walk in the door, that kind of reinforces that sense that I am part of Stanford, for example, when I walk on this campus. So yeah, it kind of depends on how that's set up. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So it feels like, I think this was true for many of us during the most acute stage of the pandemic in particular, that remote working means more and more technology, more and more screen time, more and more sore backs and eye strain and just sort of general fatigue associated with all the use of technology. Yeah. Is there any way that we can do a work from home or hybrid kind of experience without such reliance on the technology and the screens?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we can do it without reliance on technology. If we are not physically co-present, we have to have some kind of technology that mediates that interaction. So that's a given. Are there better technologies? Are there ways to interact without having as much eye strain, without sitting all of the time? I think there are. I mean, I think that there is the opportunity to develop new technologies that enable people to engage in these interactions, video interactions, for example, without having to sit at their desk and not move all day. A lot of people during the pandemic, and I still see this in use now, didn't use video. They, excuse me, they got on the phone and they had walking meetings, where they were, walking on the phone. Maybe they had headsets in, and that helped with that as well. So then you lose some of the social cues, but as long as you are having routine meetings with people that I think that's a really good solution.
How effective do you think some of these technologies are at supporting the context setting, trust development, and so forth, particularly the chat technologies like in Zoom or Slack or people IMing each other? Are those helpful to generate trust or context setting?
I think they can be helpful to generate trust. It is kind of an informal communication, which is helpful. When it's going, the challenge with chat, for example, is that you're either going to the whole group or you're going point to point, just to individuals. So that can actually be positive or negative. For example, you could have people, having this back channel that's actually, creates friction, in the meeting, or in the collaboration at a later point in time. In terms of context setting, I don't think chat is very helpful. I think it's helpful for maybe immediate context of the meeting, but less so for what it is that's going on in somebody's broader world at that moment in time.
When a team's trust has eroded over remote work, are there things in particular that you recommend or have seen from research that can help rebuilding that trust?
Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of hate to say this, but the very best thing to do, and there is research to back this up, is get people together face to face and rebuild those bonds. It's just really hard first of all, it's extremely hard to rebuild trust in any situation. It's especially hard to rebuild trust when we are not, breaking bread together, sitting in the same place, laughing together, doing those kinds of things that help you overcome whatever caused the breakdown.
Is there any other research or hypotheses you might have about trust among different groups? So for example, people who are very senior in an organization, are they more likely to have trust in a hybrid setting relative to people that are more junior or less experienced, just sort of in a different place in the hierarchy of an organization?
Trust in each other or trust in hybrid?
Trust within one another within a hybrid organization. Yeah. So, for example, would a senior team be more likely to have trust in another, even if they're working hybrid, than, for example, a group of more junior employees?
I would guess that it depends. But I would guess, all else being equal, it would be the opposite. That newer employees, employees that are more facile with the technology, that have less power, frankly, I think will find it easier to build rapport and trust. Senior people who are more senior may end up being more trusting of one another because of familiarity. If they've worked together a lot more, that's going to be a huge predictor of whether or not there will be trust. So you might see that in senior management teams because they've known each other for longer. But otherwise, what I'm seeing is that senior people in the organization, or at least mid-level managers, tend to be uncomfortable with not being able to see what people are doing, and monitor that and ask questions about it. And it's a new way of working to not be able to do that. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to it.
And do you have any advice perhaps for people who are in that situation where the leadership at whatever level perhaps doesn't see the value in allowing their employees to work remotely, either full-time or part-time, and perhaps don't appreciate the retention and recruitment issues that may be associated with that?
What would I say to them? I mean, there are some organizations, and I've talked to some of these organizations where they don't have recruitment and retention issues. So they can continue to, or they can, return to, fully in-person work. Even without retention issues, though, I think there are issues of satisfaction. If all of your friends and all of your neighbors are able to work this way and you're not, and you're in a similar job position where it seems perfectly reasonable that you could do this, and you've been doing it for 2 years really well during the pandemic, I think it can erode one's relationship with the organization if they feel like there's not a good reason. In some places, in some organizations, there is a really good reason. You actually need to be there, and maybe you didn't need to during the pandemic, but now the customers are back and you actually need to be there. If there are really good reasons, then people will accept it. But if it is just leadership unwilling to relinquish control and give people autonomy, I think that over time that can erode trust in the organization.
Thank you. Well, it is 10:59, so it is time to thank Pam and thank all of you for coming. This is clearly an issue we're going to be thinking about, and there will be plenty of research ahead for Pam and her group and for others who are working in this field. I want to thank you again, Pam, very much for coming and for sharing with all of us, and thank everyone for joining. We will be sending out a video of this presentation and also some resources. And thank you all very much, and have a great morning or evening or afternoon, depending on where you are.